Hi, I'm Admiral, and in this video, I'll once again be stepping away from gameplay-focused content to bring you educational materials. In this second episode of Pokemon Explained, we'll be focused on EVs, IVs, and natures, or, as I've taken to calling them, stat growth indicators. Both online and within my own friend groups, I've noticed that people especially struggle with EVs and IVs, so I'm going to warn you now that this episode is probably going to be pretty dense. Not only so I can make sure that I explain everything as thoroughly as I can, but also because there's just a lot to talk about. I'm serious, this is going to be a rough one. So grab some water, a snack, and a notepad, because we'll be here for a minute. Just like last time, I'll be walking you through this stuff by focusing on the WOA. What it is, how it works, and the ways that we can use it to improve as players. To start, let's look at what each item on our list actually is. That begins with EVs. And no, I don't mean the Pokemon. The term EV is an abbreviation standing for effort values, sometimes also called base points. These are numeric values that are assigned to each individual stat that a Pokemon has, starting at 0 and increasing as the Pokemon trains. So, all 7 stats, from HP to speed, have an effort value corresponding to them. These go up to 252 for a single stat, but a Pokemon can only have a total of 510. Those 510 can be assigned or invested in any way a player chooses. Effort values are why your party Pokemon will almost always be far stronger than wild Pokemon, even if they're otherwise identical. Next up are IVs, and no, I don't mean the Pokemon that evolves from Bulbasaur. Used in this context, IV is an abbreviation, much like EVs. IV is used to refer to individual values. Some people may also refer to them as individual strengths. Much like effort values, these are numbers that correspond to each individual stat. However, unlike EVs, these don't change as your Pokemon grows, and are instead randomly set when the game actually generates the Pokemon. Individual values are the reason behind otherwise identical Pokemon having different stats. Now, let's talk about a Pokemon's nature. And no, I don't have a joke for this one. Much like IVs, natures are determined at random by the game when it generates a Pokemon for the first time. Each nature determines, among other things, how a Pokemon's stats will develop as it grows. There are 25 total natures that a Pokemon can have, and with the exception of 5 neutral natures, their nature will always increase one stat and decrease another. And that wraps up the what in the WOA. This first section is always the sparsest, so next we're going to get really in-depth with the how. The mechanics behind EVs are built entirely around training your Pokemon. As your Pokemon battles, it gains experience, and in turn gains levels. However, they also receive one more thing that the game doesn't tell you about. Those hidden gains are effort values. Each Pokemon provides 1, 2, or 3 effort points to one of the 7 stats of the Pokemon that knocked it out. The actual stat that a Pokemon gives EVs into differs based on its species and its evolutionary stage. For example, most Flying-type Pokemon will give speed EVs, and a second stage Pokemon will usually give 2 EVs. Therefore, a Pokemon like Pidgeotto will give you 2 EVs into speed. Unfortunately, that rule isn't set in stone. For example, despite being a second stage normal flying type like Pidgeotto, Dodrio actually gives 2 EVs into attack instead of speed. This means that, ultimately, the player has to do research on each Pokemon in a given area to understand which EVs they'll be picking up. EVs will give 1 point into a stat for every 4 EVs put into it. This means that a fully trained Pokemon will have an extra 63 points in whatever stat you've chosen to invest your EVs into, provided you haven't split them. And make no mistake, while 63 stat points may not sound like much, those points can absolutely make the difference between winning and losing a battle. Knocking out a Pokemon will also give effort points to any party Pokemon holding an experience share. There are also ways to alter or increase EVs gained from training. Power items are items that a Pokemon can hold to increase its EV gain in one of its stats alongside whatever EVs it would normally receive from battle. The Macho Brace held item doubles EVs gained, and Pokemon with Pokerus will have all EV gains doubled, so you can even stack EV multipliers. And if those options weren't helpful enough, players can also use vitamins on their Pokemon to immediately gain 10 EVs, taking the effort out of effort values. Feathers work in a similar fashion, but only provide 1 EV. Generation 6 introduced the only way to view EVs, with a chart on the stat screen indicating general EV investments. This has returned in every mainline game since. IVs work in a much different way to EVs, and are by far the most complex topic here. So refill that water, grab another snack, consider a blanket, and get a fresh page on that notepad. I've already mentioned that IVs are determined when the game generates the Pokémon, which specifically refers to the player encountering a Pokémon in the wild, an egg hatching, or the player receiving a gift Pokémon, including your starter. Basically, any time a Pokémon shows up for the first time and you can actually use it, the game is generating that Pokémon. IVs themselves range from 0 to 31, with 0 being the worst and 31 being the best. Unlike EVs, which have a 1 to 4 ratio with the stat they influence, IVs have a 1 to 1 ratio with the stat they influence. So, an IV of 0 won't affect a Pokemon's stats at all, while a perfect IV of 31 will increase it by 31 points, but only at level 100. At level 50, the effect is halved, and it works like that for every level. So, in simpler terms, an IV's effect scales with your Pokemon's level, meaning that IVs only really affect stats once the Pokemon is at a high level. The next things to talk about are viewing and changing IVs. And, well, you can't do either of those. However, even though you can't formally view or change your Pokemon's IVs, there are things you can do to get an idea of your IVs and to improve your stats as if your IVs were perfect. On top of that, you can even breed statistically perfect Pokemon, though to be honest, breeding is its own headache of a topic. The first thing I'll talk about is getting an idea of your IVs. One option available to you is to look at this massive formula. If you reverse engineer this thing, you can get a pretty good idea of what your IV is in any given stat. Of course, that can only happen after you've invested a decent bit of time into training your Pokemon to get its level high enough for the IV to have a visible effect on the final stat. And of course, you have to have tracked your EVs, since you can't view those either. Unless you decide to edit your game's save data, but at that point, just check the IV from there. If you don't want to cheat, however, there's another method that doesn't involve any math. Since Generation 3, all games have featured a stat judge. The stat judge will give you 2 readings of one of your Pokemon. The first is an impression of that Pokemon's overall IV total, and the second is of the Pokemon's best individual IV. It's important to note that this NPC will often refer to the Pokemon's potential. That's just a stand-in for IV. The stat judge will have different dialogue depending on the IV. For example, in Pokemon Black, your Pokemon may be judged as having above average potential, with their best stat being a fantastic special attack. That indicates an IV total ranging between 91 and 120, with a special attack IV specifically resting between 26 and 30. It's important to note that the stat judge will only indicate an IV range. The exception is for a perfect IV in an individual stat. The stat total will always be presented as a range. Generation 7 added dialogue to indicate a best individual stat with an IV of 0 and with an IV of 30, but you'll usually just have a range of possible IVs to work with. Now, let's talk about improving your stats. Even though actually changing an individual value is impossible without cheating, the game does give you methods by which to change your stats as if the corresponding individual value had been altered. Hypertraining is a mechanic introduced in Generation 7 to increase a Pokemon's stats. This is done through the exchange of a bottle cap to a specific NPC. Doing so will allow the player to select a single stat to increase. This increase doesn't actually affect the associated IV, but instead adds a modifier that tells the game to treat that stat as if it had a perfect IV of 31, so its hidden power won't change from hypertraining. There are also golden bottle caps, which function in the exact same way but allow players to max out all of a Pokemon's IVs at once. It's important to note that an already perfect IV can't be altered through hypertraining, and that there's no way to lower an IV. The last thing to talk about is inheriting IVs through breeding. This is thankfully brief, since I'm not going to sit here and explain breeding, too. Unless you want this video to have an extra 10 minutes on its runtime, I just have to assume some prior knowledge here. But I will make a video on it if you ask nicely. Anyway, a baby Pokemon will inherit 3 IVs at random from its parents. That's 3 total, not 3 from each, meaning that the remaining IVs will always be random. However, there are a couple of ways to circumvent this. First, Generation 4 introduced the power items. Alongside boosting effort values, as mentioned previously, these can also force an IV inheritance. For example, if a parent is holding a Power Bracer, which boosts attack EVs, the baby Pokemon will always inherit that parent's attack IV, and then receive 2 more random parent IVs. Starting in Generation 6, players also gained the option to equip a parent with the Destiny Knot to allow the child to inherit 5 parent IVs instead of the usual 3. And that just about wraps up the how for IVs. Last but not least, we have natures. And natures, thank God, are relatively simple. Just like IVs, natures are assigned to a Pokemon at random upon generation by the game. These influence stats as the Pokemon grows. I've intentionally used different language here from EVs. While EVs only change as a Pokemon trains, i.e. by battling and winning, a nature will exert its influence regardless of the experience source. So, rare candies in the daycare, for example, will not circumvent a Pokemon's nature. But what does a nature actually do? I've already said that a nature will increase one stat and decrease the other, with the exception of 5 natures. Those natures increase and decrease the same stat, leading to neutral growth. And now, for the moment you've all been waiting for, natures increase one stat by 10% and reduce another by the same amount. That's it. That's all they do. Like I said, natures are very straightforward, but it's a bit disingenuous for me to say that that's all they do. Natures also affect a Pokemon's flavor preferences, so if you're trying to build friendship with a team member, you'll need to know what they like and dislike. They also determine certain forms and evolutions. Also, you probably want to know how to change a nature. Prior to Generation 8, you couldn't. However, Sword and Shield introduced mints, which kind of do to natures what hypertraining does to IVs. Mints will change the stat modification on a Pokemon to match the nature represented by that mint. So, for example, a Pokemon with a brave nature whose trainer uses an adamant mint on it will see its stats change from plus 10% attack and minus 10% speed to plus 10% attack and minus 10% special attack. It's important to note that, just like hypertraining, mints will only affect the way the game reads stat growth. Other things determined by nature, like flavor preferences and toxel evolution, don't change with mints. Now, all that we have left are ways that you can use these 3 things to improve your gameplay. I'm not going to be separating this last section of the Wawa by topic, because these things don't exist in a vacuum, so you shouldn't think of them separately as you work them into your personal playstyle. The first and most obvious thing to pay attention to is that you can use stat growth indicators to optimize your Pokemon's stats from the moment you catch it. Understanding how a Pokemon's nature will influence its stats and using that, alongside their lack of EVs and the formulas I showed you to calculate their IVs, can help you determine whether or not that Tailo you caught outside of Rustboro is worth taking to the end of the game. There are also resources online to help you calculate IVs without doing the math yourself. But like I said before, these things don't exist in a vacuum. You should also be considering the overall context of your playthrough and your specific needs to decide if a Pokemon is worth investing time and resources into training. It's important, therefore, to develop an understanding of what niche each Pokemon fits into, so you can then tool their stat growth to help them best fit into that specific role. For example, a Shuckle will rarely outspeed and one-shot an opposing Pokemon, but it has the best defensive stats in the game. So it's very clear what Shuckle's niche is. Its role is to take hits, and either set up hazards, inflict opponents with status conditions, or do a mix of both. With that in mind, you should ideally look to have a Shuckle in your party with high defensive IVs, and to invest EVs into Shuckle's HP and defensive stats to ensure that it can take a lot of hits to fill its role as effectively as possible. On the opposite end of that spectrum, let's look at a Pokemon like Salamence. With an impressive base speed and strong offensive stats, it's clear that this Pokemon is naturally built to be a highly offensive sweeper. However, with Moxie as a hidden ability and a mostly physical moveset, it's worth considering that Salamence's physical attack is oftentimes going to be more valuable than its special attack. Therefore, you may want to find a Bagon with stronger attack and speed IVs, an adamant nature, and then invest heavily into attack and speed EVs to ensure that it can fill its role as a physical sweeper. However, you may instead want to consider prioritizing speed, as Salamence also functions well as a tailwind setter. Most Pokemon can fill more than one role, so it's important to consider both a Pokemon's innate talents and the specific needs you have at that point in the game. If you're only at the first or second gym, you probably just want a way to beat the gym leader. On the other hand, if you're at the Elite Four or in the post-game, you'll likely want to have a diverse team to handle any threats that may pop up during your final battles. And with any luck, you'll have been considering these later needs from the start and will only need to think about minor adjustments, like hypertraining or mints, to get your team where it needs to be in the late game. You can also benefit by having Pokemon with worse stats. Speed control and priority are 2 of the most important things in Pokemon. Put simply, if you're faster, you move first, which means you deal damage first, and therefore can beat your opponent's Pokemon before they beat yours. However, if your Pokemon has access to a priority move like Extreme Speed, you may not need to invest as heavily into speed since you'll pretty much always go first anyway. That may let you focus on EV training to take hits better from the Pokemon you can't one-shot. You may also want to consider Trick Room, a move that reverses the turn order so that slower Pokemon move first instead of faster Pokemon. If you suspect that an opponent may look to use that effect against you, having Pokemon with worse speed IVs and no EV investments into speed can be a boon. Understanding how the game calculates a Pokemon's stats throughout its growth cycle is vital to developing as a player, but I'd like to leave you with one last piece of wisdom if you're still struggling to fully grapple with this stuff, since I know that it's difficult for a lot of players. It's very likely that none of this will matter for you right now. Unless you're looking to break into competitive Pokemon or to start doing challenges, like Nuzlocking or playing through a game with only one Pokemon like a weirdo, you don't need to know any of this. I'm going to say this next thing twice because I think it's really important for newer players to hear. If you are a strictly casual player, anything beyond a basic understanding of the type chart is a quality of life improvement. Again, for casual players, you don't need to know a single stinking thing beyond type matchups. Understanding proper setup, learning stall tactics, breeding perfect Pokemon, getting your team fully EV trained before the third gym, these are all things that can make your game wildly, fantastically easier, but not one of them will make the difference between beating the game and not. I beat my first Pokemon game when I was around 6. I could read, and I knew that fire beat grass and water beat fire. That's pretty much it. The rest of it, I figured out by losing. A lot. Tate and Liza beat the crap out of me because I didn't realize that Blaziken loses to them 9 times out of 10. But that doesn't matter because I did it on the 10th try. As we reach the end of the video, all I'm really trying to convey is that I don't want you to stress about your improvement or your understanding of Pokemon at a higher level, especially if you're new to the games. These videos are for you to learn, not to feel judged. We all have our own paces, and I've made a point to repeat that this is incredibly dense stuff. I already had a pretty solid understanding of these mechanics, and I still found myself learning new things as I was writing the script for this. And the great news is that nobody is perfect at this game. World champions make mistakes, so it's okay if you make mistakes too. And you can always find new ways to learn. Get on Pokemon Showdown and mess around with your friends to test strategies, watch actual competitive matches, and find YouTube videos made by people better at Pokemon than me and learn from them instead. Or, if you insist on learning from me, this is a very small channel, which means that I have the scope to respond to questions in the comments. Now, I'm going to get off of my soapbox and end the video, since I got a little off track there. If you enjoyed this video and happened to learn something along the way, I'd appreciate it if you could like the video. While you're down there, you should also consider subscribing. At the time of recording this, I'm only 8 subs away from 69, and shooting for that goal specifically is just funny. Also, please consider leaving a comment. Your feedback lets me know what I'm doing well, what I'm not doing very well, and what you might like to see from me going forward. And speaking of going forward, next on my list of videos to make is a return to Pokemon X. The last time I played that, I only had one Goodra and spent 3 hours on my first run of attempts to beat the champion, so I'm looking forward to a far less painful playthrough. After that, I'm not quite sure. I'd like to make explained videos a bit more frequently, so please let me know if that's something you're interested in. I'm definitely considering videos on breeding and on setting up properly, but that all depends on what you want to see. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.